scandal broke in British newspapers. King Edward VIII wanted to marry American divorcee Wallis Simpson, but Parliament could find no way to allow it. At the time, the rules were very clear. The monarch is the head of the Church of England, and it was simply untenable that the king could marry a divorcee. It was against the law. Despite Sir Winston Churchill's intervention and attempts to change the law at that time, it was not acceptable to the British government, and King Edward was forced to abdicate the throne to be with the woman he loved.
When their uncle, David as he was known to the family, otherwise King Edward VIII, abdicated, it was Princess Elizabeth who told Princess Margaret, and she said, "Uncle David's going away and Papa is to be king." And Princess Margaret said to her, "Does that mean you're going to be queen?" And Elizabeth said, "Yes, one day." And nothing more was ever said about it or between them. And Princess Elizabeth, as we know very well, is able to compartmentalize aspects of her life. So she realized, this girl of 10, that one day she would become queen.
It came as a great shock to the royal household. Elizabeth and Margaret's father, King Edward's younger brother, Prince Albert, was to become King George VI.
In a moment, the story.
Albert adored his two girls from the very beginning. While Margaret is said to be a bit more rambunctious, young Elizabeth, who was called Lilibet at the time by those closest to her, is said to have been very well behaved and serious beyond her years.
King George VI, he always referred to himself, his wife and two daughters as us four.
Us four. They were a wonderfully tight unit.
They never anticipated their ranks and their position and their responsibilities changing. Very much they anticipated carrying on as being this very close-knit, very loving us four.
George's relationship with his daughters is a very good one. He had a deep affection for both Elizabeth and Margaret. He was a family-orientated man who took great pleasure in watching them grow up and ensuring their development. He also saw them as the future of the monarchy, so they therefore received a training in what it was to be young members of the British royal family from him and his wife. He had great expectations for both of them.
George VI was said to have called Elizabeth his pride and Margaret his joy. Much of Princess Elizabeth's lessons in life have been well taught by her father, who prepared Elizabeth to be queen as soon as he was coronated. It's likely that this boost helped to inspire Elizabeth's well-known loyalty and devotion to the United Kingdom. The new king of the United Kingdom asked his eldest daughter Elizabeth to write an account of his coronation, so that she would one day feel more prepared for her own. Elizabeth did as she was told, and she would write about her father in a very loving tone, addressing him as her papa, and that he looked very beautiful on that day. It is reported that she saw a haze of wonder throughout Westminster Abbey as her father was crowned. The royal family split their time up between their house in London and one on the grounds of Windsor Great Park, where Elizabeth and her sister were privately tutored. Elizabeth was educated with the focus that she studied subjects that would bear significance for her future reign. These included European history, constitutional history, and laws, some of which were taught to her personally by Henry Martin, Vice Provost of Eton College. Religious lessons were taught to her by the Archbishop of Canterbury. Elizabeth was also taught both German and French, and became very well versed in the works of Shakespeare, Coleridge, Keats, Browning, and Tennyson, among others.
George had been preparing Elizabeth to one day succeed him as the British monarch and as head of Commonwealth. The way he'd done this is to essentially demonstrate to her what the role of monarch required, and also give her opportunities to begin to develop her own public role.
At the age of 13, Just a few months before the war, Princess Elizabeth became infatuated with a naval cadet who gave her family a tour of the Royal Naval College in Dartmouth, and they began exchanging letters in July 1939.
Princess Elizabeth met Prince Philip at a family wedding, but she can't really remember that moment. So the reason we know so much about it is because her governess, Marion Crawford, talks in great detail about their first meeting at Dartmouth College, where Prince Philip was a naval cadet. And he was very, very good looking, 18 years old, very striking, blonde looking. And he was assigned to look after the two princesses, Elizabeth and Margaret, for the day, for their visit, while their parents went around the college. It's quite strange to think of an 18-year-old looking after the princesses, the oldest of whom was 13. But he decided that it would be fun if they jumped the tennis nets. So he took the princesses outside and he jumped the tennis nets for them, and they were very, very impressed. Later he went on board the vessel that the King and Queen had come to Dartmouth in, and he had lunch, and then the following day he went and had tea. So that was the meeting that the princess remembers.
In September 1940, shortly after the start of Germany's bombing campaign on the towns and cities of Britain, 5 high-explosive bombs were dropped on Buckingham Palace. The Royal Chapel, Inner Quadrangle and Palace Gates were hit, and several workmen were injured.
After the palace was bombed, they're both absolutely terrified. The king wrote in his diary that he couldn't quite believe what had happened and that he was very, very lucky to have escaped. But days later, he's still writing, "I look outside, I can't forget seeing the bomb."
I think that the King and Queen saw the bombing of Buckingham Palace really as an important public relations opportunity, using it to demonstrate that the royals were on the front line like their people, that they were suffering from the war along with the British public. Cameramen, journalists were invited into Buckingham Palace to survey the damage, to photograph it, and images emerged on the front page of newspapers of the king in amongst the rubble, in amongst the debris of Buckingham Palace, demonstrating that the king, he was also affected by what was going on.
The sisters spent most of their war years at Windsor Castle, and like many other children, they were away from their parents. The young princesses were 2 of over 3 million people, mainly children, who left cities for the safety of small towns and the countryside over the course of the war.
The young princesses also had an important public relations role to play during the Second World War. Their whereabouts were kept hidden, mainly out of concern for their safety, and it was initially rumoured that they might be taken to Canada to be put out of harm's way. But instead, there was great emphasis placed publicly on the fact that they remained in Britain, but were separated from their parents, so that they, if you like, symbolised the experience of evacuation, separation from their parents, members of their family. In that respect, they were upheld as symbols of the war experience, symbolic of their generation. In fact, we know now that they spent most of the war at Windsor Castle. Most evenings they were reunited with their mother and father who returned there. But in terms of the public narrative, in terms of what ordinary people read and knew about, they were separated from their family.
On October the 13th, 1940, when she was only 14, Elizabeth gave a radio broadcast from the drawing room of Windsor Castle as part of the BBC's Children's Hour in an attempt to boost public morale, as people had been evacuated from their homes due to World War II.
5 famous little hearts are stirred as the Dion Quints listen to a broadcast from London by Princess Elizabeth, a message of cheer to children of the Empire.
My sister is by my side, and we are both going to say good night to you. Come on, Margaret. Good night, children. Good night, and good luck to you all.
Princess Margaret adds her farewell to the broadcast in the end. She spoke directly to the children who had been separated from their families as part of the evacuation scheme.
It was very, very professionally done. And then Princess Elizabeth, always thinking about her younger sister, she brought her younger sister in at the very end and said, "Come on, Margaret." And "Come on, Margaret" became a catchphrase in America. The speech went down an absolute storm in America.
During the war, King George VI started assigning some royal responsibilities to Elizabeth.
Elizabeth joined the military and they were girl guides, and in fact apparently Margaret was a very good girl guide and loved a lot of the exercises that they had to do. And I think that they genuinely wanted to be like all the other children and to be treated, obviously they were never going to be treated the same, but they were experiencing similar events going on, and that's very unifying for the country.
Reviewing the girl guides at Windsor Castle, the little princesses Elizabeth, 12, and Margaret, 8, assumed new importance. But war or not, Elizabeth had her duties. She celebrated her 16th birthday with a review of the famed Grenadier Guards.
Princess in overalls. On her 19th birthday, the heiress presumptive to England's throne learns a few facts about tires and carburetors. Elizabeth is in the ATS, or British WWII, and at the King's request, is being treated just like any other trainee. Now, visited by her parents and sister Margaret Rose at a training station in southern England, she shows them she knows a fan belt from a spark plug all right, and isn't afraid to get her hands dirty.
It had been 5 long years since war broke out, and the nation was gearing up for a celebration like no other. King George VI made a radio broadcast to the people of the Commonwealth to mark the end of the war.
We give thanks to God for a great deliverance. Germany, the enemy who drove all Europe into war, has been finally overcome.
The King spoke about the sacrifice that ordinary members of the public had made, that sacrifice had been worth it, in that the war had been won, fascism had been beaten, and that democracy would now prevail.